Welcome to our podcast called Collective Impact with your hosts, me, Mariella Lacour Alma.
And me, Sandy Nessing.
Each episode features leaders at the forefront of responsible businesses, sharing how they align their teams, build integrated strategies, and drive results that matter. Tune in for candid conversations and practical lessons from the voices shaping the future of business. I'm Mariella Lacour Alma, CEO and co-founder of Datamaran, and I've spent the last 11 years on a mission to integrate sustainability into the DNA of every major company in the world.
And I'm Sandy Nessing, Senior Advisor at TRC Companies with nearly 30 years in sustainability and communications, helping companies turn ESG strategy into lasting impact.
We're here to explore how organizations and leaders make responsible business part of what they do, from shaping their business strategies and building alignment to creating impact for people, planet, and performance.
Throughout the series, one theme comes through again and again. The most effective organizations are those that treat ESG not as a separate initiative, but as part of how they do business every single day.
We'll hear from our guests about what that looks like in practice, the opportunities, their challenges, and the transformation that comes when sustainability is truly integrated. It's very much the vision of Datamaran, making sustainability part of the DNA of organizations everywhere so they can be successful and real change can occur.
DEI was never about fashionable. You can't retreat from something that ultimately is going to be critical in the long term. If you really want to hear a woman's perspective, you probably need more than one of me.
Hi, everyone. So, today's guest on our podcast, and I'm personally very excited about this, is someone who has reinvented entire industries more than once. Mindy Grossman is a powerhouse leader known for taking big, bold swings and transforming iconic brands along the way. She spent her career at the intersection of style, retail, and wellness, with leadership roles at places like Tommy Hilfiger, Ralph Lauren, and Nike.
And she became a household name at HSN, the home shopping network, where she turned the network into a modern digital shopping experience and then took the company public. Then she brought that same transformational energy to WW, formerly Weight Watchers, leading a major rebrand and pushing that company into the digital wellness era. Mindy is a trailblazer who doesn't wait for things to happen or opportunities to come her way. She makes them happen.
Today, she serves as partner and vice chair at the Concello Group, where she advises companies on how to grow, innovate, stay culturally relevant, and build sustainable businesses. She's been recognized by Forbes and Financial Times as one of the most powerful women in business. So please today give it up for Mindy Grossman.
Thank you for having me. I know it's always going to be a great dynamic conversation.
For listeners who might not know you, could you please introduce yourself, Mindy, and share a little bit about your background?
So, just to give some perspective, I spent 45 years in the consumer space. As I said, for 45 years, the consumer was my client, starting in the apparel industry, working for iconic founder designers from Jeffrey Banks to Ron Chereskin to Willie Smith in the 80s, and then Tommy Hilfiger and Ralph Lauren for 10 years, where I turned around one of his businesses and then launched Polo Jeans Company, then joined Phil Knight when he came back into Nike to transform their global apparel business, which was an incredible experience at the time. It was true transformation. Then joined Barry Diller, as you mentioned, Sandy, for the reinvention of what was a portfolio, including Home Shopping Network, to really bring it into the digital, mobile, as well as the experiential and entertainment platform, the World of Editorial Program Commerce. Took the company public after a couple of years. And then after 11 years, I'd been very, very passionate about the health and wellness space and said if I was going to do one more thing, I really wanted it to have both human impact and financial impact. So I was able to join Oprah in the reinvention of Weight Watchers, not just as the number one most efficacious weight loss program, but to really help people live better, healthier lives overall, which again is more important today than ever. And now I'm part of Consello Group, which has been amazing because now I can work with CEOs and teams on growth and transformation and take that experience as well as my boards that I'm on and create impact in different ways.
Thank you so much, Mindy, for that introduction. I'm hearing you talk about transformation and leadership. I think looking back at 2025, what a disruptive year we've had. You speak frequently about how to be a leader during disruptive times. So I'm curious, how do you look back at 2025 and how are you personally preparing for the year ahead?
Well, in a strange way, the good news is I've experienced a lot of disruption before. So I took uh, HSNI public in August 2008, 2 weeks before the Lehman bankruptcy. And I thought that was going to be the crisis of my career. And then had to literally save the company during COVID because of the makeup of our company. But one thing I learned through both of those experiences was the importance of not of leaning forward, of leaning into what was happening, of really understanding, regardless of the disruption in the environment, how are you looking at your culture? How are you looking at your business? And how did you want to use it as an opportunity not to hide from it, but to lean in and say, what should my business look like? How am I innovating? How am I continuing to differentiate in this environment? So if you look at HSNI, again, first time company, public company CEO, first time with a brand new board. But I went in and I said, look, yes, this is disruptive, but there are difficult decisions I have to make, but I believe we can actually grow in 2008 and 2009. So here's the strategy, and here's what we have to protect. Number one, our innovation agenda in mobility and digital. And because of that, and because of the support, we actually grew in 2008, 2009 at HSN. And we were the first retailer to do video commerce on an iPhone. And then the business dramatically accelerated from there. And the other important thing, both then and today, is the critical nature of keeping your culture and your team's focused on the vision. As I always say, you need to have expansive vision and radical focus to get through this. Fast forward to 2020. We entered 2020 at WW going to have the biggest year in the company's history. We did a 9-city tour, 20 to 40,000 people per arena with Oprah. And the finale was March 9th, 2020 in Denver. Well, the following Wednesday, we had to shut down. But the most important thing, we had 1,000 in-person workshops a week in 13 different countries. And I brought the team together and said, the most important thing is, yes, there are business implications, but we need to keep our members with us. This is a difficult time. We can't let them not have their community. I called Eric Yuan at Zoom and I said, we have to do this in less than a week. And in 6 days, we took all the groups of the companies, refocused them, and we were able to move all 30,000 of those week workshops in 6 days to virtual. And really galvanizing your organizations around what was important was a true learning. So now fast forward and we're seeing what's going on, political disruption, social disruption, AI, you know, obsession, all of this uncertainty around the economy. And with all of that, you can, eh, you can see, but you've got to keep people focused. What is your business? What is your competition? What is your opportunity? What are you going to stop doing? What are you going to start doing? And I've been spending a tremendous amount of time really looking at AI and how CEOs and companies are managing. And that is what leadership is in this environment is really making your organization understand what's going to be important, not allocating it to others, having very clear and concise communication. And I remember saying during COVID, I'm not just the chief executive officer, I'm the chief communication officer, the chief resilience officer, but I'm also the chief hope officer of really what's going to happen and why can we flourish in this environment if we make the right moves. I've always defined myself as a resilient optimist. I'm not going to change that. But if you look at companies who are handling things this way, they are continuing to evolve and move forward versus the companies that are hunkering down and not innovating and not using this time to rethink. And the statistics are there from the 2008 and 2009 period, 2020, and coming out of COVID. If you really look at the studies, those companies that took the opportunity to really lead, to really focus, to really innovate are the ones that came out ahead.
What an amazing story and what an amazing career that you have had, although a bit non-traditional, correct? So, can you talk a little bit about how resilience and determination helped to shape your journey, both personally and professionally?
Yeah, I think in general, when I make a move, people either think I'm crazy or I've had a midlife crisis or something in between. But, it really, my whole life has been defined by, being able to look at risk taking and boldness as the essence of transformation. And I always say not taking a risk is often riskier than taking that risk if you've really done the homework and you believe, because you can always make pivots along the way. And I was an adopted child whose parents said, you can do anything you want. If you've been given this opportunity, use this opportunity. And, graduated from high school as a junior, went into college, was going to be a lawyer, got engaged when I was 19, and my whole life was set out for me. And then getting ready to go into my last semester, senior year, I kind of blew everything up and called my parents and said, I have something to tell you. I'm breaking my engagement. I'm not getting married. I'm not going to law school. I want to be in business and I want to be in a business of some form of creativity. And I'm leaving for New York right now and I'm going to figure it out. And I say, everybody was like, what are you doing? And I said, no, I know this is the right path for me. And it was. And there I moved to New York and ended up in the fashion business, the men's fashion business to start. And so, throughout my career, I've been very purposeful. It's not been, oh, I'll just try this. There's been a lot of thought going into it. I try and each time use what I call a purpose filter. What questions am I asking myself at different points in my life about what changes I'm making? My mantra has been passion, purpose, and impact. Is it something I'm going to be passionate about? Is it purposeful? And again, what that means is going to be very different in different points in your career and life stages. But most importantly, will it have impact? And I always say you can have impact at every single stage of your life and your career. You just have to focus on that and make that something that you think is important, whether you're at the beginning of your career or whether you're down the road in your career and you really have a platform. And that's when it becomes more and more important. But I'll never forget when I made the decision to leave Nike. And I loved being at Nike. To this day, I've never worn another brand but athletic apparel or footwear. And Phil Knight was an incredible inspiration and still is to me. But I was doing this insane commute between New York and Portland, Oregon. I was out of the country 30% of the time. My daughter was going into her later stages of high school. My parents weren't doing well, and I had to make a move. And everybody would thought, oh, you were the head of global apparel at Nike. You were the most senior woman. You were number two. What's she going to do next? And I remember going in to tell Phil I was leaving, and he was incredible. And he said, I'm sorry you're leaving. Look what you've done to the business. If you ever, I know you'll be successful, but if you ever want to go back. And he looked at me and he said, but if you told me that you were leaving for something predictable, I would have been very disappointed in you. And when I told him I was leaving to go work for Barry Diller and take over what was called IAC Retail at the time, which was Home Shopping Network, a portfolio of catalog businesses, a German shopping channel, and a falling auction channel in the UK. Business was not in good shape at all. I was going to be the eighth CEO in 10 years. So you can imagine even what the culture was like. But I was very fortunate in those 6 years at Nike, spending so much time in Asia and other countries where mobile was really exploding. And there I was looking at a business that I felt could take advantage of everything that was happening in mobile, of how consumers were going to consume content in a very different way, how retail was going to be changing, how digital and mobile, and how brands were becoming distribution captive. And we could create this whole new dynamic of editorial program commerce. Anyway, I, left my conversation with Phil, and he ended up calling Barry and telling Barry, you really have someone, which, that tells you something about the human being, which is why I've always felt um, you know, that ability to both be vulnerable, resilient, and strong at the same time and focus on other people's success. But when it was announced that that's what I was leaving Nike to go do, I will be honest. There's a lot of people that thought I was crazy. And to be honest, there were people that dismissed me. And I have never dismissed anyone unless they're toxic or not a good person, because a lot of times you don't see what they see. And it was very interesting at the beginning stages of Home Shopping Network at the time, where I had to completely change the landscape of brands that would be part of our ecosystem. And you really find out who people are. But I was very, very fortunate that over the course of my career, I built incredible relationships, and I had people who had trust and belief and came with me on the journey. But it was definitely a challenge at the beginning.
Thank you, Mindy. I loved what you said earlier about combining this expansive vision in combination with having radical focus. I think it's inspiring that you can be a leader as well as a doer, right? I think that's something that you really take to heart when you talk about impact and get it done during times of disruption, especially at times of disruption and seeing that opportunity. But perhaps let's talk a little bit more about you as a female leader. We have to talk about it. This is a female panel today. You are an example to many as a female leader. But that's not always easy, right? You need to meet the right people also, perhaps along the way. You talked about some challenges before that you came across. So I'm curious, what was your experience as a female leader, and how did being a woman in business shape your view on how to be a leader?
You know, it still is a serious conversation today. When I started my career, I moved to New York in 1977 and went into the menswear industry. There were no women running a menswear company. There were no women running a women's wear company. And I remember my first role, I was the assistant to the CEO of an international division of a big menswear company. And I really wanted to transition into a combination of sales and merchandising, but there wasn't a single woman who they would entertain being part of the boys club, and I had to leave and go take another role. And I was very fortunate, interestingly enough. I got a junior sales assistant role, but part of my role was taking over for the receptionist for lunch during the day. And this one day, young black designer, Jeffrey Banks, who had license with the company that I was part of, and Rocher Company, and he came in and he was watching me behind the desk, not just be receptionist, be on the phone and calls with salespeople and giving them ideas on what could be. And he ended up going in and telling the CEO that he wanted me to work for him and be part of the sales organization. And that's how I got that promotion. And I tell people all the time, do more than you're supposed to do, you know, prove that, you have the capabilities. Anyway, I ended up from there, being one of the first women CEOs in the menswear industry when I took over as the CEO of Chaps Ralph Lauren. But one of my challenges was at the time, women hid the fact they had families. They felt they had to be two different people. And I said to myself, it's hard enough being one Mindy, nevertheless being two Mindys. And when I had my daughter, I said, I have the ability to set an example. And I brought my daughter to work and I let people know when I had to leave for something with school because that's not what all companies were doing. You had to dress a certain way, you had to be a certain way. And again, you had to be two different people. Even throughout my career, definitely faced challenges, whether it was my first trip to Japan, on business. And I was the only woman I saw, and people naturally assumed I was either the assistant or the interpreter. And, you know, you have, I had to really prove, as you will, and really understand how I needed to lead in my role and how I needed to build cultures, but also how I needed to use my voice for others and recognize who was at the table. And I remember being at Nike and I had just started again, first person out of the apparel industry to run the apparel business, most senior woman in the company. And I remember, I tell the story, I went into my first basketball meeting and there's probably 60 people in the room. I was the only woman and everybody's going around and speaking. And there are people from all areas of the company. And all of a sudden, I opened my mouth to say anything, and everybody started staring at me like, what was she going to say? And I started laughing and I said, guys, I am a white 40-year-old woman from New York who never played basketball. I said, if you really want to hear a woman's perspective, you probably need more than one of me. And everyone laughed. And it wasn't defensive. Like I just tried to be that person that could bring things out on the open. And with that, Phil had come to me and said, Mindy, I need your help. We're losing valuable assets in women. And I want to know why. And I said, are you really serious about this? And he said, yes. I said, well, okay. And we ended up doing a complete diversity and inclusion survey of the entire organization globally, identified that people just felt there wasn't enough inclusion. And we ended up doing a white paper around the importance of diversity and business success. We worked with Catalyst and a group, and I ended up starting their first Women's Leadership Council, brought all 160 women leaders around the country together. We started a lot of mentoring programs. And when I saw the difference that made, it reinforced for me just the importance. And fast forward to today, it is the same situation. I'm very close with Shelley Zalis, who started the Female Quotient. You look at why it is so important to have diverse voices around the table. And again, not just female voices, but voices from different levels of experience, life stage, capabilities, etc. And I think it has to be reinforced by leadership, more today than ever.
I'm just going to follow up on that and just say that I too have been the only woman in the room many, many times. I'm sure, Mariella, that's happened to you as well. And it can be really intimidating, especially if you are, let's say, an introvert, like I was, especially younger, earlier on in my career. It's very hard to step out and be seen and, speak up. Do you have any tips for especially younger women coming up through the workforce? Because I think that we're seeing some workplaces go backwards to that more traditional, old way of doing things, which makes it that much harder for women to break through.
So I would say a number of things. I think one of the things that has benefited me is find your allies, find the people who will support you, who believe in you. And whether that's in the company, outside the company, that's very, very important. And I've said to women a lot, it's great that we're all coming together and talking to one another, but we have to talk to more than ourselves. We have to be in environments that are diverse. We have to create allyship to support efforts. And there are a lot of incredible male leaders, other diverse leaders who are doing that. And how do we hear their voices and get them to be advocates for change? I think the second thing is build your network so you're not feeling isolated. And what I mean by a network are true relationships, and people that you can bounce things off of because we're all very different. Our approaches are very different. We've all had different experiences. So, who can we learn from based on things that they've gone through or, can add to our thinking when, as you said, we're that person in the room and we're waiting for that moment, and what is the right way and how do we prepare? And I think of it sometimes as well as you know, when I was CEO and having a board or being on boards now, it's not just a board meeting. How do you have interactions when you get into the board meeting? You could have the right conversations and you've built that trust. So you can have what I call productive discomfort about the difficult things that you have to address. But that when you leave a room, you have respect and you're all meeting aligned. Those are the kind of things that are really important. And again, I think more today than ever.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I'm shifting gears a little bit now, looking at leadership a little bit more in depth and getting future proofing of your business, right? You've certainly led a lot of companies through major change. When you think about your experience, what would you say are the most important qualities for leaders to have today? You talked about communications earlier, and you've also said that the best leaders are the best communicators. Can you talk a little bit about that, but also some other qualities that leaders really need today?
Yeah. So, I talk about this in different ways because I used to get asked is what are the qualities of female leaders? And I said, okay, stop. The qualities of leadership, right? True qualities of leadership are genderless, right? You want to be able to galvanize people and build a culture. You want to be able to strategically build a vision for the business that can be implemented and executed throughout the organization. You need to be able to build relationships and be able to communicate what you're doing with all your stakeholders, which is really critical. You need to aim for execution and performance. You need to be able to build what I call a pivot organization where people are not afraid to take risks. The number one factor that can destroy a company is fear, where people feel they understand what they have to do. And if something goes wrong, they're very comfortable in articulating it. All of those things are very important. But I also have always said that one of the true qualities of leadership is empathy and vulnerability. And when I first said that, people were like, oh, that's because you're a woman. And then COVID happened. And if you remember, the number one quality of leadership that came out during that was vulnerability and empathy. And really being able to get up there in front of your organization or whoever you have to interact with and really articulate what is happening, understand what people are feeling, acknowledge that, and bring that to life. And I remember at WW, I started a bi weekly conversation series with people from outside the company to talk about what was happening and to hear from others how they were handling things. And I'll never forget, I had a conversation set with Ken Chenault, who was running American Express at the time. And it happened to be right after the George Floyd murder. And we had a very big conversation on what was happening in the world. And you can't hide from things. You have to be able to let people know that you're seeing what they're seeing, and you have to bring it to the front and be able to have very honest discourse and conversation. I think that's really important today that leaders address what's really happening in different areas of the business and, get feedback. You want to get feedback. That's really important. But if people don't feel comfortable being honest, that's not going to help you.
Yeah. I think, Mindy, it's really liberating in a way to hear you speak about how you can just be one person all the time. Bring one Sandy, one Mariella, one Mindy to work and do that with a lot of empathy because, quite frankly, who has the time to play all these roles, right? And I think hearing you talk about how you are one person at work as the same as the person at home is encouraging and liberating for me. But this year, right, we've seen a backlash on business in terms of DEI, sustainability. At the same time, I think you posted a few weeks ago on LinkedIn that, especially in the US, a declining rate of women on boards. So we are facing all these backlashes, right? And as we continue to bring our enthusiastic and powerful selves to work, how should we read this, right? How should we read these, let's say, external factors, and how do we make our way through it?
You and I have talked about this. DEI was never about fashionable, right? It was about pure, directive, acute importance for business results across all stakeholders. And there is pure empirical evidence done authentically and correctly that is the case. I think we went through a period where a lot of people checked boxes, right? And if you are going to build a strategy, if you're going to build a company that's going to lead and move forward, you really have to address all of these issues in a very strategic way. You need diversity of experience, and that goes across every area of diversity: age, race, gender, ethnicity, life stage, experience. Look right now, do you want to have a board that doesn't have deep AI and technical experience with someone as well in the company integrating that? Do you want to have a board that can come together and have the acute conversations about what is going to influence the business? And if people don't bring all different voices to the table, you're not going to be able to have that. You're not going to be able to drive culture, and you're not going to be able to drive business. And I think we talk about this too emotionally and not enough factually. I think the other thing that's very important is there were too many instances of people being overly not just provocative, right, but polarizing. We don't want to be in a polarizing environment. We have to bring people with us. And I think CEOs who are retreating because they feel it's not, DI time, are not doing the right thing. CEOs who are looking at what's the right thing for their business, what's the right thing for their stakeholders, what's the right thing for their employees and consumers at the heart of it, are the ones that are going to build culture and have greatest success. I was just listening to Scott Strazik at GE Vernova. You look at Ed Bastian, for example, at Delta, and other CEOs that we admire. They have the ability to stay focused because they have one intention, right? One intention is how are they focused on leading the best organization for the long term and making the decisions that are going to be right and building a culture and a community at the same.
Bringing it back to business risk and opportunity there. I agree with you. I think, a lot of companies were starting to look at sustainability ESG disclosures too much as a compliance exercise. And then on the other side, there was too much of the ideological conversation that seemed to take precedence there. So we want to see companies that remain to be bold, right? That continue to see how the world around them has actually changed, how these new risks and opportunities play out. How would you, with your lens on the business community, how would you identify the winners and the losers there? How would you identify boldness?
Well, look, I always say, risk taking and boldness are the essence of transformation, but you also have to understand the difference between risk and suicide. Okay. Whether it's in your personal life or your business life. So you really have to take the time to go through all of the factors and decide what level of risk you can take. And every business is going to be different. Where you are in a transformation, what are the factors that are creating the challenges for your business? But you've got to keep moving forward and you can't retreat from something that ultimately is going to be critical in the long term. You just need to face things in. And you also have to, I taught a couple of classes on the CEO's perspective on business transformation. And I say, transformation can be one of the most overused words in business. People put a new sign on the wall and they think they're transformed. Transformation is large, wholesale, radical change. And what do you need? You need the vision of what that long term, you need the focus of what you need to do to execute. You need the alignment and the belief of your employees in the organization. You need the support of your board. You need investment dollars. And then I say you need resilience. And I put up a slide, and on the left side of the slide are all of these articles on how brilliant and bold and everything I am. And on the right side are she's, not not good, whatever it is. And you're the same person, but it's not a linear path. And you're going to have challenges and you're going to have to go through harder times, but you have to keep articulating and use. And Declan Kelly at Kinsella, he always says you have to give the breadcrumbs along the way. And he advises more CEOs than anyone right now. And the most important thing is the continuation of the narrative and the proof points of why you're moving forward and why this is going to benefit all stakeholders and the business in the long term.
I'd like to pull on that thread a little bit because you also talked about culture. And in my mind, culture kind of underpins your ability to do all of that, right? I had the privilege of working on culture for about 10 years. So I saw firsthand how it impacted, profitability, innovation, customer satisfaction, and customer service, and the ability to execute on strategy. What does culture look like going forward in this age of disruption? What do we need to be thinking about? Um, to future proof, if you will, the business, but having culture underpin that.
Look, I think we went through many years of a lot of disruption. And if you think of the internal culture, we were all work at home for a period of time. There's a lot of conversation about back to office. There's pros, the noise around that is pretty significant. So I am a firm believer in certainly building culture, but also building relationship. And I do think face to face interaction, however a company wants to structure that, is critical. I know personally that I would not have had my career if I had not put myself forward if I had not been noticed, if I didn't have the relationships that I had up and down through the organization. When I think of mentorship for myself, I have mentors today in their 20s and 50s who I'm learning from, and I have mentors that I had along the way. Those things are really important to culture. I also think making everyone feel valued. And I also say that my success is because I've always focused on making other people successful and trying to understand what they're going through. And again, every company is different today, and you have to galvanize it in ways where people that feel they're part of something that's really making a difference, that they have allyship within the company, that their voice makes a difference. I think that's really important. And I think sometimes you have to make statements, especially if you're a new CEO. I remember when I was coming in to be the CEO at IAC Retail at the time, HSN. And as I mentioned, I was the eighth CEO in 10 years. And so it was going to be my first day. The head of HR said to me, "What do you want to do on your first day?" And I said, "What does everybody else do on their first day?" She goes, "They go to employee orientation." I said, "Well, I'm going to employee orientation." She says, "Are you serious?" I said, "I'm very serious." I go into a room, there's about 30 people, and they're going around the room. I work in backstage TV. I'm in merchandising. I'm in the call center, whatever it was. And they got to me and I said, "I'm Mindy Grossman, the new CEO." And it was shock, but I spent the entire day in orientation. I answered phones. I went into backstage TV. I went into creative, merch, everything. And so the net, and it spread like wildfire. Because when you're the eighth CEO in 10 years, they're just waiting for you to leave. So when I did my town hall the next day, people felt I was already different. And the culture was willing to embrace. Now, not everybody is going to, right? Well, I said, there's three kind of people. There are the evangelists who are there are the wait and see, and there are the toxic, right? Not going to. Well, you're not going to be here because you have to have everyone aligned. So that's just my story. Everybody has different stories, but you've got to do something to create that belief, to create that culture where everyone is there to support one another. They're willing to take risks and they believe in what they're doing.
Thank you so much, Mindy. I think one of the things you mentioned here today was about, success not being linear. And I think that is definitely something that currently also, right, in the market that Datebrand operates in is pulling us through. We've seen different things also throughout COVID, but perhaps more personally, and to all those people working on responsible business and caring deeply about response. What would you say to them that are facing some adversity today and who might want to aspire to become the next Mindy Grossman? How to not give up, because clearly you're not giving up anything.
Yeah, no, no, I'm not. I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I think people need to realize they're not alone. This is not one person's role or job to do. Find others who you can lean on, who can support, know how to use your voice, find your allyship within the company as well as without, and keep that fortitude and belief in what is really true. And then I see the second thing is, keep going back to here is the reason why. Here are the facts. Here's why we have to stay focused because ultimately it's going to create greater outcomes for everyone. And that's the most important thing, as well as for the world.
So in this age of AI, we go back to what we are made of, human beings. We rely on ourselves and our relationships and we push through. I really like that.
I'll tell you, I hosted an event at my apartment with Shakti Capital on AI. And it was about 26 people. It was a very interesting group of tech, of founders, of investors, etc. And we talked about every element of what was happening, positive, negative, etc. And it went full circle. And when we wrapped it up, Cable Desai, who was the founder, he summed it up in a way that really resonated to me in saying, this is not just potentially the fourth industrial revolution, but this could create the next great human renaissance. And let's not forget that we are not losing humanity. We want to elevate humanity. And, that's how we have to think about it.
And that's a great place to wrap. We could be going,
We could go forever.
we could go forever. That's correct. We could go forever. But thank you so much, Mindy, for being with us.
As always, so great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mindy, for joining us on our first episode of Collective Impact.
And thanks to all of you for listening in. Collectively, we can make change happen. To learn more about Mindy and her latest work, check out the links in the episode notes. If you want to stay in the loop on everything responsible business, including exclusive content, events, and the chance to send in your questions for future guests, join Harbor, our community platform for sustainability professionals. And don't forget, follow Datamaran on LinkedIn or Instagram, or visit our website for more details. Harbor is also available as an app in both the Apple App Store and Google Play, and you'll find all the links in the episode description.
Thanks for listening, and catch you on the next episode of Collective Impact.